Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Robert Talisse. He is W. Alton Jones Professor of Philosophy at Vanderbilt University. His main area of research is political philosophy, with an emphasis on democratic theory and liberalism. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So, Dr. Talisse, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Ricardo, thank you. I was very pleased to get the invitation to join you because I like your program so much.
Well, thank you so much for the kind words. So, before we get into political philosophy specifically, tell us a little bit about pragmatism, because I know that's something you explore in your work. What is it, and how does it apply specifically to political philosophy?
Very good. And I'm glad that you started there because pragmatism as a philosophical framework or orientation informs a lot of my work on particular things. So it's always nice to start with the background. So pragmatism was an idiom. I don't want to call it a school. It's an idiom of philosophy that is indigenous to North America, that emerged at the end of the 19th century and flourished in the 20th century and continues today. It's a form of empiricism and naturalism. So empiricism is the view that all knowledge has its root in experience, or that experience is where we begin philosophically thinking about whatever it is we want to think about. And it's a naturalism because it rejects the idea that there are facts about the world that transcend experience, or that there are philosophical entities, or that philosophy has to begin with some other world other than the one that we live in. So naturalists are suspicious of transcendental entities and abstract objects and these kinds of things. So it's a philosophy that's rooted in a standard kind of empiricist naturalist tradition, much like British empiricism of Locke and Hobbes and Locke and Hume. However, beginning with the founder of the idiom, Charles Sanders Peirce, pragmatism works with a more complex conception of experience. So on the British empiricist model, simplifying of course, experience is always understood in the first instance at least as sense perception. That experience is what happens when you open your eyes and take in a breath and touch things, right? And to be sure, it's perfectly reasonable why somebody might begin there and thinking about what experience is. But starting with Peirce and then through William James and John Dewey, what emerges is a conception of experience that is more Darwinian. Now note, Hume and Locke and Hobbes and Berkeley, the British empiricists are pre-Darwinian. So in Peirce, James, and Dewey, the founding American pragmatists, you get this conception of experience that tries to understand experience primarily in terms of the organism's interaction with various features of its environment. So you get this Darwinized, biological, not merely cognitive or mental, but a biological conception of experience as a kind of activity, as experimenting in the world. Okay, I could go on about pragmatism and what follows from it. Let me just say one quick thing and then get to the political philosophy question. When you are an empiricist and a naturalist and you see experience in that Darwinized way, it turns out that a lot of the preoccupations of much of 17th and 18th century, through the early 19th century philosophy, what we call the early modern period, turns out that a lot of the problematics of philosophy from the early modern period get refigured, right? because think about, bent sticks in water, or the problems of, am I dreaming? Descartes' problem. Am I dreaming right now? So just think about all of the problems of knowledge, the metaphysical problems about objects, and can we know objects in themselves, so on and so forth. When you're an empiricist and you think about experience in this biological way, a lot of that gets reshuffled in ways that pragmatists like to say sort of dissolve the philosophical problems. And in fact, one of the, I think, lasting impacts of pragmatist philosophy beyond continuing work on pragmatism is that it introduces, I think, into the philosophical idiom, in the West at least, that distinction between solving a philosophical problem and dissolving it, giving up on it, showing that it was poorly framed in the first place, and so no longer calls for an answer. In fact, the pragmatists, again, starting with Peirce, but you get plenty of this in James and Dewey, see that that's their main sort of critical mode of philosophy, is showing that the long-standing problem doesn't ask, we no longer need to solve the problem of knowledge. We can dissolve it because we can call into question and challenge, and then eventually replace the terms that make that problem formulable in the first place. Last thing on this, for interested listeners, think about Hilary Putnam, a good, more contemporary pragmatist. Putnam's answer to skepticism, right, brain in a vat skepticism, is a pragmatist answer, because the ultimate upshot of that argument that listeners might be familiar with is not that we've proven that we're not brains brains floating in a vat of cerebrospinal fluid in some lab somewhere. The Hilary Putnam upshot, or the argument, the upshot of Putnam's argument, is that the very premise that we are brains in a vat is really nonsensical. It's non-formulable. Once you understand once you understand how reference works, you no longer get right to formulate that skeptical problem. That's a good example of the kind of pragmatist undercutting of a philosophical problem rather than trying to solve it in the terms in which it's posed. Okay. How does this all figure into political philosophy?
Right.
It's really John Dewey. So he's the last of the three of the trinity that founds the idiom, where political philosophy, and in particular democratic theory, becomes sort of central to the pragmatist trajectory. Peirce, Peirce was not a political thinker. Peirce never projected. Peirce was a kind of academic outsider, actually, and a big thinker. Right? Thought of himself as the next Hegel, that next Kant or Hegel, and so was never able to secure a lasting academic position because he apparently was a very difficult human being. But he was regularly projecting a large, like, First Critique style volume or phenomenology of spirit kind of volume that would encompass his entire system. And so we have, in his unpublished works, lots of projections and outlines and drafts of a table of contents, and there's no political stuff ever in Peirce's mind as part of the system, although it's a kitchen sink otherwise, right? So everything else is in there. James didn't write much about politics, although a lot of what he did write has some political implications. It's with Dewey that you get what has since become understood, I think rightly, as a core pragmatist insight, which is that democracy in particular is the political expression or the political manifestation of the conception of philosophy that begins with experience, understood as this Darwinian experimenting with the world, right? So what leads Dewey to make that connection is Dewey sees replaces the traditional problem of knowledge with this idea about how does scientific inquiry work. It seems very successful. How do we understand inquiry? Inquiry is not merely a beholding of the world. Inquiry, as the scientist practices it, is experimenting with the world, formulating hypotheses, testing them, revisiting, reformulating, testing again, these kinds of things. And Dewey thinks that all rational thought is this kind of experimental tinkering, revising, going back and trying again, being pushed around by the world, pushing back in certain ways. And Dewey understood democracy as the political expression in the collective and social realm, right, of that kind of attitude. So it's in Dewey that we get this connection. Now, I'm not a cheerleader for any of these guys, by the way. I don't consider myself a scholar of any particular philosopher, for that matter. But certainly, I'm not a scholar of Dewey or James or Peirce, although my work engages with their work. As a political philosopher, pragmatism, I think, allows me to say or think the following kinds of thoughts. Democratic politics, in part, is an epistemic endeavor, right? If it's experimenting, if it's this sort of inquiring, it looks like our account of democracy's merit, our account of its value, perhaps even our account of why we should favor democratic political arrangements, is going to invoke certain kinds of epistemic considerations. Now, that's different from what is still, to this day, pretty mainstream, although it's no longer, I wouldn't say it's obviously a dominant view, but, a pretty mainstream view in democratic theory, and a long-standing view in democratic theory, has always been that the merits or value or justification of democracy lies strictly with something else, some moral value. Democracy realizes a commitment to equality or fairness or collective autonomy, or some more what we might call sort of sociological value. Democracy is stable. Democracy allows a peaceful transition of power. Democracy staves off revolutions, these kinds of things, neither of which are epistemic. I think that, and this is one of the reasons why I think my views are still identifiably pragmatist, I think that the epistemic is a separate, irreducibly distinct site for thinking about the value of democracy. How's that? I could go on, but how's that to start?
Yeah, no, that's a good introduction, let's say. But I would like to ask you about certain particular issues that political philosophers point to when it comes to democracy. So what about the problem of pluralism? First of all, what is it and how can we deal with it?
Sure. So here's one place in my thinking where John Rawls, the 20th, early 21st century Harvard philosopher of a kind of influence that's really hard to underestimate. Here's where a feature of John Rawls's thought figures very centrally in my thinking. And again, for listeners who are familiar with this, just as a side note, I'm deeply influenced by the parts of Rawls that are not commonly thought to be the most influential part. The first book, A Theory of Justice, is a wonderful work of political philosophy, and I admire it and all the rest. I don't think that's where the deepest insight is. I think the deepest insight, Ricardo, is about pluralism. And I think that Rawls complicated our thinking about pluralism in politics in a way that is not only astute, but I think productive. Here's Rawls's thought. Now, the problem of pluralism, of course, is the problem that there's moral disagreement. And some of the moral disagreement is of such a character as to be viewed among the disputants as disagreement among something non-negotiable, right? Something non-compromisable. That when we disagree about politics, we're not always just disagreeing about two acceptable views and we're arguing about which one is optimal. Sometimes often maybe even our political disputes are among options where among the disputants, you know, one or other of the leading options is morally suboptimal in a way that's very serious or intolerable even.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem of pluralism is the problem that under standard constitutional or liberal democratic institutions, institutions that treat us as political equals, one of the upshots of that treatment as a political equal is that we get to make up our own minds. We don't get to dictate to others what they must think. And so moral and political disagreement seems to be the upshot of liberal democratic institutions. The Rawlsian insight is that the scope of that disagreement, although it's very, very broad, there are going to be very severe disagreements even among people who all are committed to liberal democracy. That's, I think, the really important insight of the later Rawls, of the Rawls of the book Political Liberalism. We're not talking about the problem of pluralism being the problem that, well, under certain kinds of social and political conditions, some people are going to wind up being misogynists and other people are going to wind up being fascists and these other people are going to wind up being hierarchical thinkers and they're not going to really be, their convictions aren't going to be fully on board with the moral premises of constitutional democracy. The Rawlsian insight is bracket those people off for a second. We still have a big problem. The big problem is those same institutions will create conditions of deep moral disagreement among the people who are on board with liberal democracy, right? Because the Kantians, the utilitarians, the atomists, the Hobbesian, right, whoever you want to, the Humeans, they're going to have philosophically opposed conceptions of the fundamental values of liberal democracy: equality, autonomy, fairness, liberty. And each of their conceptions of these ideas will be fully consistent with a legibly liberal democratic order. So they want the same thing at the end of the day, but their disagreement over the fundamental ingredients of that order can, under certain contexts, fall into this category of disagreements where, among the disputants, the other side's commitments are non-negotiably unacceptable. And so the Rawlsian sees, and I'm a Rawlsian in this little regard, right? The Rawlsian sees the problem of pluralism as the problem of reasonable pluralism, the problem of deep moral disagreements among all the liberal constitutional Democrats in the room, leaving aside a different problem. That say it's different is not to say that it's not important. The different problem of the pluralism that emerges as such, you get, you get people who are oligarchs and epistocrats, and we're leaving those anti-democratic views aside. Even if you get the people who all want, at the end of the day, to live under a liberal constitutional order, you still have a problem of giving a philosophically robust enough account of the fundamental ingredients or commitments of that order to start running a political mode of association. You still have enough disagreement among all of the liberal constitutional Democrats in the room to make for a problem. That's why, last point, and then you could follow up and let me know if you want to get deeper into this. That's one of the ways in which I think the pragmatist insight that epistemic considerations are part of the story of the value, merit, and justification of roughly a liberal constitutional order. That's why I think that's so valuable, because I want to argue, ultimately do argue, right, that there might be a broad range of reasonable disagreement about moral commitments, about what the nature of equality and liberty and autonomy and all the rest of the values that go into a liberal democratic order. There are lots of room for reasonable moral disagreement over those fundamental liberal democratic values, I want to say there's a lot less room for reasonable disagreement over the epistemic norms that are in play. And so I want to argue that we can begin. Maybe we can't give a full case for the merits of liberal democracy. We can begin our argument for liberal democracy by looking at the epistemic stuff first. How's that sound?
Well, let's go on, and then perhaps we can decide on it. Okay, so before I get into another problem I would like to address, on what grounds would you say is democracy justified as a political system then?
Well, I think that it's helpful just to begin with another, what I see as a pragmatist insight. There's no justification überhaupt or as such, right? I want to say there's justification that's not in the sense of the fallacy, that's ad hominem. We are justifying to, right? There's not just justification as such. Okay. So I want to say, well, justification of a political order is always justification to. Here's another pragmatist move. Apart from just, doing political philosophy in my office here, when does the question of political justification of the overall democratic order arise? And so I want to say, justification is not justification to, it's justification to some particular audience under a context, right? Within a circumstance. Okay, what are the circumstances, another good pragmatist question, what are the circumstances under which justification for the democratic order is demanded? And here I want to say, okay, the question of justification arises in context, or most typically, when it arises when it needs an answer, it's arisen in a context where it's the day after the election and some fellow citizen is deeply disturbed by the outcome and is wondering, why uphold any of the norms? If democracy can produce this result, why not defect? Why not exercise sort of Hirschmanian exit? Why not get out? Why not move? Why not become an opponent of the institutions and work to unseat them or undermine them? So I want to say that's where our justificatory story should begin, with that fellow citizen who sees in a democratically produced result something unacceptable, non-negotiable, intolerable. And now we want to say, okay, here's the reason why you should not suspend your commitments to democratic institutions, but uphold them. That doesn't mean that you can't be a critic or a resistor or a dissenter. It just means, right, that you have to work within the confines of democratic norms for the sake of repairing, improving, and rebuilding your democracy. Now there, I want to say, any straightforward value argument that says, well, Ricardo, you wanted policy P, everybody else wanted policy Q. Policy Q looks to you not merely regrettable, but intolerable. But you know what? Fairness is really important. So the value of fairness outweighs the badness of this outcome. That kind of argument, or equality or autonomy or whatever, that kind of argument looks to me like a non-starter in this context. So I want to argue, and have argued, that there are epistemic norms that democracy as a political mode of organization helps to manifest in a way that's better than any of our available alternatives. That's another crucial pragmatist rider, right? It's like, these are comparative arguments always. When we're justifying democracy, we're not just, proving democracy from a set of premises. the argument is always going to be intrinsically comparative. Democracy is better than some range of options, some range of feasible options. And I don't think that that makes the argument crassly instrumental, right? I still think you can think that there's intrinsic value to democracy, even if you think the case for that value is fundamentally comparative. So I want to say that there are epistemic norms that a democratic order does the best to secure, given our options, and and your investment in making sure those epistemic norms can be upheld. That's the reason why you should sustain your democratic commitments rather than defect and go rogue. How's that?
So, okay, so apart from the issue of people in democracy having moral disagreements, what about the issue of public ignorance? I mean, because that's another big one, right?
Yeah. So, it's interesting. And let me just start by conceding something.
Okay.
It strikes me as undeniable that, especially in the United States, today even, voter ignorance the level of voter ignorance is atrocious, right?
I think that's not just in the United States, let me just say.
It's not just, but it's especially in the United States, right? That is to say, and this is, I think, an important point, levels of voter ignorance are variable. So, you go to some of the Scandinavian democracies and there still might be a problematic level of voter ignorance, but it's not anywhere near the level of ignorance that you see in the US. Canada, average voters in Canada have more political base knowledge, knowledge of the basic facts of their constitution than the average American voter. And the fact that it's variable, I think, is important because I think it's very easy to be led by some of the voter ignorance data in the US. It's very easy to be led to think that human beings as such, or it's something about the structure of human cognition that voters are ignorant. If that were true, you wouldn't see the kind of variation that we get. Okay, but let me just concede. Voter ignorance is extreme, it's atrocious, and it's a real problem. So I'm also not an optimist. It's another pragmatism. I'm not an optimist, right? About any of this stuff. I'm trying to lay out what it would be to try to make it work and to make it better and to set ourselves up so that we could improve it. But I'm not an optimist. Now, and again, let me just run through in the U.S. And you could tell this, by the way, just by some of how the midterm campaigning is going. In the U.S., voters think that elected officials control the prices of things, for example. Now, it might be that the president of the U.S. can introduce policy or can engage in some kind of diplomatic interactions with world leaders that will have the effect of raising or lowering, the output of oil barrels and things like this. But the American voter tends to think that, Joe Biden sets the price of gasoline at the pump at the gas station on the corner, for example, and they want to blame him or, credit him. Okay. That's one thing. So the actual office, the duties of political office are often mysterious to the average American voter, and the average voter doesn't know how to assign responsibility for particular policy and other features of the political order to the right representative. The American voter doesn't know the three branches of government established in the Constitution, can't tell you what's in the Eighth Amendment. They can tell you about the Second Amendment just fine. They can't tell you about the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment. They, don't know the history of the constitutional jurisprudence, despite all of the talk that goes on in the U.S. Among average voters about what the Constitution is and how important it is. There's very little grasp of the Constitution as a full document, even though there is a lot of public discourse around some particular bit of the Constitution, like the Second Amendment or the First Amendment. Okay. And I could go on with this. So what you might think of as these sort of nuts and bolts data about American government that look like they're plausibly regarded as necessary conditions for understanding broader political phenomena. Looks like this basic nuts and bolts information is mysterious to most voters. And some, Jason Brennan, the political philosopher, Ilya Somin, the political theorist and law professor, my colleague here at Vanderbilt in the political science department, Larry Bartels, right, take this data, which is very robust, and say, voters don't have this basic knowledge, they must not have this more sophisticated kind of knowledge, and so they can't do what democracy would ask them to do in order to produce reasonable, let alone rational, but even minimally reasonable government. And so democracy on this account winds up looking roughly like what you get criticized in Plato's Republic, right? It's the kid let loose in a candy store view of politics, right? They're driven by irrational forces. There's a strong man or some elite that figure out ways to tap into the channels by which people can be flattered, right? This is a big thing in Plato, flattering the masses, and that's how people get control. And people get control, they want to hold on to control. And so the idea of governing for the common good goes out the window, and politicians, once they get elected, take their job to be re-election. And the way you re-elect is by playing on these sites of ignorance in ways that stimulate voters to go cast a vote in your favor. I accept that entire picture. However, as just descriptively accurate.
Mm-hmm.
The conclusion to be drawn, or the strength of the conclusion to be drawn, though, seems to me to still be in question. Now, let me say something philosophical. You know, I gave a talk this past weekend, and I was making a similar point, and I said, here's a place where the philosopher just is smarter than the political scientist, and but let me just say, I'm not going to put it that strongly, although part of me wants to. Look, as I'm sure you're familiar with, and lots of people listening to us are familiar with, there are different kinds of things we call ignorance, different kinds of cognitive state that are called ignorance.
Right.
And maybe there are even certain kinds of state that are called ignorance that are not really altogether cognitive. They might be more affective, right? Like certain forms of racial hatred we call ignorance. Not sure that it's right to think that that is a cognitive state. But let's just stick with the cognitive stuff.
Okay.
And here's the, you know, someday when I get a little bit more time and get my head together, I'm going to try to write a book on this, I think. A lot of the public ignorance data, a lot of the data about the epistemic failings of the American citizen and citizens elsewhere, just to speak to your point, a lot of the instruments by which these data are collected are too brute or coarse to make what strike me as deeply important philosophical distinctions that are very familiar to, you know, anybody who's had a decent first 2 weeks in an undergraduate epistemology class, right? So just think about a couple of different ways in which somebody might be politically ignorant. You know, you don't know the 3 branches of government established in the United States. Okay. Is it that I don't know because I forgot one? I would get the wrong answer on the test. And then somebody just says, it's the legislative. And I'm like, oh, crap. Yeah, it's the legislative. Darn. Right. And now I got it. I couldn't remember it. I just guessed. Right. So that's one way of being ignorant. Another way of being ignorant is for somebody to say, I know what the 3 of them are. Right. It's the guy in charge. It's the person who controls the factories, and it's you know, just imagine somebody just giving 3 branches that are just, you know, it's the minister of truth, it's the minister of art, and it's the party leader. Those are the 3 branches. So, okay, that guy gets the wrong answer on the poll as well. Ignorant of the three branches of government, just like the first guy, does not seem to me to be in the same state of ignorance as the first guy. And it seems to me that there's an important political difference between them that's not being tracked by this kind of data collection instrument. Imagine somebody who, gets the, thinks it's the legislative, the executive, and the media. Just imagine somebody who thinks that, right? Forgets about the judicial and thinks it's the media. Okay, gets the wrong answer. But you might want to say, well, wait a minute. What if, now we're just imagining a possible one. What if, this person was kind of weirdly misled, that the sources that otherwise should be regarded as reliable sources regularly were telling this person the media is, or suggesting that the media is a branch of government. And that's why they think it, right? That still seems to me to be somebody who is ignorant in a certain sense, but not in the same sense as the other two. So let me just lay it out this way. The instruments by which we gather these data about voter ignorance are too brute to capture the difference between true belief, false belief, right? True belief without justification, false belief with justification, false belief without justification. In epistemology, one of the first things we learn is that, well, there's the way to evaluate the content of what you believe. What you believe is either true or false. Then there's this other kind of evaluation that winds up to be very complex, what we might call justification or entitlement or warrant, whatever you want to call it, that has to do with how you assess your evidence. It might also have to do with how sensitive you are to the evidence that's out there. That looks like these are two different things that go into justification. But very quickly, you can see that in order to make sense of the political understanding as a purely cognitive thing that voters have, you need to get pretty nuanced about, right, the question of is what they believe true or false? Then the separate questions about, for those who believe what's false, is it on the basis of incomplete but reliable evidence that because of its incompleteness is misleading? Is it on the basis of misleading but very, very easy to acquire evidence, or what would be regarded as evidence? Is it on the basis of the fact that evidence has been hid from them? Is it just on the basis of their epistemic recklessness? Now, it looks like a lot of the negative assessments of democracy on the basis of this literature attribute to voters who have false beliefs about fundamental facts about their government, are always quick to just attribute a kind of recklessness or irrationality to the voter. The voter has the false belief because they don't care about the evidence, haven't gone and looked for it, or have mishandled it in some way. And the way I read the data collection methods, it doesn't code for any of that. So all I'm going to say now is, follow up, right? All I'm going to say now is, this is a deeply suggestive, uncommonly rich and robust collection of data about something we're calling voter ignorance or political ignorance. It shows something that is not good about the state of U.S. democracy. I'm going to even grant that. What it shows, though, I think is entirely underdetermined by the evidence, because the instruments just don't make the nuanced distinctions that I think we would need to make in order to get the full diagnosis. And so, last point, if I'm right about all that, the normative upshot, the prescription, seems to me to also be underdetermined. Like, if people are ignorant because they're subjected to misleading evidence, or because the way that the media environment is set up makes it too difficult for them to separate out reliable sources from non-reliable sources, if all that's true, well, then we get, one kind of normative upshot, right? Figure out some way to disseminate information in a more reasonable way. Make it easier for citizens to do the cognitive work of democratic citizenship. If on the other hand, and I'm not dismissing this out of hand, if on the other hand, Ilya Somin and Jason Brennan and the sort of the epistocrats, the people who say, right, that because voter ignorance is the way that it is, we need to explore some deviation from democracy as we know it. Rule by experts or shrinking government so that ultimately government does very little, and that's controlled by experts, right? Those are the two views roughly of Brennan and Somin, right? They might be right. So I'm not even saying these guys are wrong. I'm just saying it's not clear what the data show. So any broad sweeping prescription looks to me to be insufficiently motivated by the data because it's too indeterminate. How's that?
I mean, that's interesting, I think. But I mean...
interesting is a very good bar. I like that.
No, I mean, I was just thinking that then there would be lots and lots of work to do in political science to sort of... I mean, I'm not sure if this would be the correct way to put it, but redo these studies, right?
Or to combine them with, and again, since I'm not a political science, I mean, I'm affiliated with the political science department. I learn modal logic, not stats and methods, So I don't know how to think about the designing of better tools to get the kind of data we need. But I think that I don't know if we need to go redo, but we do need to more fine grain the kind of data that we have by way of new instruments. Let me say one other thing.
Okay.
On this, just very quickly, because I think that there is an emerging line of response to the voter ignorance stuff that looks promising to me, although I'm not ready to get on board with it. There's a certain kind of epistemic Democrat, that is a person who, like me, thinks that the case for democracy, at least in some, maybe large part, is an epistemic story. I'm thinking about Elaine Landemore, among others. Who thinks that the voter ignorance data don't get the prescriptive upshot that Brennan and Somin and Bartels think that they do, because political intelligence is intrinsically collective. The voter ignorance stuff is about individual epistemic shortcomings. Landemore drawing on some sort of results having to do with the wisdom of crowds sort of stuff, particularly this Hong Page, diversity trumps ability stuff, says, no, political intelligence is intrinsically collective. It emerges, right? It's sort of supervenient on individual inputs. And the individual inputs at the end of the day don't matter. What matters much more, she argues, with, I think, compellingly, but I'm not ready to dive in. She argues that what matters is the cognitive diversity of the group, rather more epistemically matters is the cognitive diversity of the deliberating or of the demos, rather than the epistemic merits of any of the particular members. Interesting argument. It would be big news if it were, if you can make it all work out. That would be a wonderful result, I think, for us Democrats.
Yeah. So one last topic then. We've been talking a lot about democracy. What about liberalism and how does it connect to democracy?
Good. Liberalism is another, almost like pragmatism. There's a lot of different views about what liberalism is. So let's make a first cut distinction that I think has to be made, and I'm going to make it in a way that's totally, I hope, is non-objectionable, and then might say some more controversial things. So let's make a distinction between liberalism in the idiom of political discourse, popular political discourse, and then liberalism as a sort of political philosophical framework. So by liberalism, I take it, Ricardo, you're not asking me about Bill Clinton and Barack Obama liberalism. Okay, good.
No.
So in the United States, and this, even the vernacular changes from one country to the other, because liberalism in Germany just means something different as a political, popular political term of discourse,
sure,
or popular term of political discourse. So we're talking about a philosophical framework that has its origins in at least Locke, right? Maybe a little bit earlier. If you go back, or people go back and look at Plato's dialogue, the Crito, right? The one where Socrates is being, Socrates' best friend is trying to convince him to escape from prison. Socrates gives this indirect set of arguments about why it's wrong to break the law. One trajectory in that argument is straightforwardly liberal, because it's a social contractarian argument, right? It says the city says you made an agreement under fair conditions to obey the law. Our side of the bargain was to create social conditions where you could live a life and have a family and do a trade and all the rest. We kept up our side of the bargain. Now you owe us. Straightforward social contract argument that looks to me like fundamentally a liberal argument. And here's why. Not all social contractarian stories are liberal. Hobbes is not a liberal. Arguably, Rousseau is not a liberal. But Lockean social contract story, social contractarianism, and I think the germ of that is in this Plato argument, are liberal. Here's what liberalism is then as a philosophical framework for thinking about politics. And note, these are claims about how to think about politics. I don't think liberalism, despite long debates in the 80s and 90s in political philosophy, I don't think liberalism has to be understood as a theory about human nature or a theory about metaphysics or a theory about anything. It's a theory about how we're thinking when we're thinking about politics. When we're thinking about politics, we think that the individual is normatively primary. It's the thing that comes first in our thinking. It's normatively prior, not only because it's first in our thinking, but the importance of the individual is normatively, the individual is normatively more important than the collective. Some people see in that some suspicious atomistic metaphysics. I'm just saying this is a theory about politics. I don't know that it required, I think it's perfectly consistent with whatever you want to say about individuals metaphysically. That's the more controversial stuff that you can come back at me with. So we start with individuals. We understand individuals as having a politically significant status independent of the rights and privileges that are conferred on them by a state or by a collective, right? So part of liberal thinking is that when we're thinking about politics, which means we're thinking about states and laws and constitutions and collectives that exercise power that's coercive, right? But when we're thinking about politics, we have to think that the individual has a normatively important status that must be adequately or duly acknowledged or recognized, independently of what the founding documents or the state or the law says. That there are some constraints, therefore, on how the individual may be treated by the state or the collective in virtue of the fact that there's some moral status that they enjoy simply as they are understood apart from political ties and associations. Okay. Typically, this is spelled out in terms of rights, right? Natural rights. I don't think we have to say that, but that's one way of understanding what are the unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as one of the founding documents of my country puts it. That's one fundamental thing. Another fundamental thing is then the idea that the individual understood as having that prior to politics status is equal to every other individual in that regard. So there's a fundamental commitment to the moral equality of persons from the point of view of politics. That doesn't mean that everybody is the same. That does not occlude or eradicate or erase difference. It just says from the point of view of politics, individuals not only have this standing that politics has to recognize, but individuals are equal with respect to that standing. So far, this should all be familiar to at least those listeners who live in liberal democratic societies. Now, here's the real crucial thing that I think is where where stuff gets even more tricky. And this is where I'm going to sort of plant my flag for a certain interpretation of liberalism. I'm not a social contractarian. I'm not a utilitarian. John Stuart Mill was a liberal, but for utilitarian reasons. John Locke was a liberal, but for natural law reasons. I'm what's called the justificatory liberal. I think the following. Given this fundamental premise of moral equality on the basis of this pre-political sense of an individual and his or her entitlement that constrains what the state may do, liberalism, as I'm ready to defend it and as I understand it, is the thesis that when a collective, when a political collective in particular, introduces policy or acts in some way that exerts power over you, either requires you to do something you're not inclined to do, requires you to do something you don't want to do, don't think you should be made to do. The last part is important because you might want to do it, but don't think you should be made to do it. Right? Anytime the state exercises power over you, there has to be a justification for it. And that justification, if it's going to be duly recognizing of and respectful of your equal moral status, has to be formulable in terms that that are legible to you as reasons. That's what I think liberalism is. It's again, this connects up in ways we can get into if there's time with my epistemic conception of democracy. That's what the core of liberalism is. It's a justificatory enterprise. It says exercises of coercive power, all exercises of political power are coercive, right? Exercises of coercive power stand in need of justification, and that justification has to be formulable in terms that are legible as reasons to the citizens over whom the power is exercised. What do you say about that? Now we're really doing philosophy, right? We're not just talking about philosophy now. Now that's a real philosophical thesis that is it's not just my story, but it's not the only story there is about liberalism. But how does it sound to you?
I mean, it sounds good, but I'm not a professor. So, I'm not even sure if I'm a contractarian or. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about or a utilitarian. I'm really not sure about that. So perhaps, and taking into account the time, perhaps we will wait for your next book, as you mentioned during the interview, about hopefully public ignorance or something like that. And then perhaps we can get more into some of the nitty-gritty about these kinds of questions. So
that's good.
Yeah. Okay, so Dr. Talisse, just before we go, would you like to just tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Oh yeah, so I'm a professor at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. A lot of my stuff is on the Vanderbilt Philosophy Department webpage. I'm also on Twitter. My handle is just my name with no spaces, Robert Talisse. Although I should say, maybe as a bit of warning, my Twitter is not particularly academic. It's mostly jokes about academia and some clips of my incredibly amateur guitar playing. But that's where people can find me. And if anybody within earshot of my voice on this podcast has any interest, you can feel free just to email me. My email is on the Vanderbilt webpage, and I'm happy to talk to people about anything that might come up as a result of the conversation we've just had, Ricardo. Thank you.
Great, and thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show again.
No problem at all. It's good to talk, and let's keep in touch.
Yeah.
And let's keep in touch.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing and to keep the channel sustainable, please consider supporting me on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of this interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check the website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, KARIN, LIETZCKE and BLANCHETTE, LARSEN, GUERREIRO. Francis Ford, Hans Fredrik Sunde, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Vissel, Jakob KLINKBY, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Muller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vos, Wo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Enguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernardini, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Ivan Bodrenko, Paul Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Aslan Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W. João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila DEZA-ARAUJO, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonho Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Lietzcke, Dennis Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Todd Shackelford, Sonny Smith, and John Wiseman. My producers Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Luís Caetano, Tom Wagner, Dan Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Muller, Vega Guidi, Sardus Francis, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.